Hi, everybody. I'm Gene Hyde. I'm head of special collections at Ramsey Library at UNC Asheville and host of the Library Brown Bag series. And we'd like to welcome everybody for coming. It's a really great turnout. A little bit of housekeeping stuff here. You are all on mute right now. That doesn't mean you won't have the opportunity to talk later on, but we have found with this particular platform, Zoom, if everybody's on mute, it makes the sound quality better for everybody during the presentation, but you will have the opportunity later on to ask questions. And I'm real happy to introduce two of my favorite colleagues from UNC Asheville who are speaking today, Dan Pierce and Ashley McGee-Whittle. Dan Pierce is the author of 6 books, most recently Tar Heel Lightning, How Secret Stills and Fast Cars Made North Carolina the Moonshine Capital of the World, which was published last fall by UNC Press. He serves as Interdisciplinary Distinguished Professor of the Mountain South and Resident Professional Hillbilly, his words, Michael McPhee's words, at UNC Asheville, where he teaches courses on the South, on Appalachia, on North Carolina, and the national parks. Joining him is Ashley McGee-Whittle. She's Special Collections Assistant Archivist working with me here at UNC Asheville in Special Collections. She has a bachelor's degree in history from UNC Asheville, and she's currently working to obtain her MLIS, her library science degree, from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She currently sits on the Society of North Carolina Archivist board as a second member at large, and her research interests include Southern Appalachian history, North Carolina history, women's history, and environmental history. Dan and Ashley, good to have you.
Thank you. Dan's wanting me to take it away here, so I will get started here. First thing I'm going to do is share my screen. So as Gene said, my name is Ashley McGee-Whittle, and I'm the Assistant Archivist under Gene here at Ramsey Library Special Collections. As Gene also said, I graduated in 2016 from UNC Asheville with my bachelor's degree in history, and that was extensively under Dan's mentorship. I have a very personal interest in this project. I'm an Old Fort native. I'm 5 generations from this area at least that I know of. I also come from a railroad family. The picture on the slide that you're seeing right here is my grandfather. He was my maternal grandfather. His name was Paul Brigman. He worked for more than 30 years for Norfolk Southern as a conductor. His nickname was No Bill because if anyone asked him if he had a dollar that he could spare while out on the job, he would shake his head and say, "I don't have no bill." My stepfather also works for Norfolk Southern, and he's been working with them for 10 years now as an engineer. Dan asked me this morning to talk a little bit more about why I was personally interested in this project, other than just being from a railroad family and being from Old Fort. And there's a lot of reasons. Probably one of the most significant, though, is as follows. I'm a historian and an archivist. My job isn't just to help folks find sources, but my job is to also evaluate those sources in order to find an accurate timeline of events. We do this to identify and conserve the memory of history. And for too long, much of Appalachia has been stereotyped and whitewashed, and it's past time to uncover and share in the hidden history of this area. They're not always pretty histories, but they are history, good or bad. And by bringing these stories to the public, I hope that in some small way, I'm able to contribute to the journey for social justice for Appalachia's disenfranchised minorities. Let's talk about some railroad history now. So when people talk about the history of the railroad in Western North Carolina, they think about how the railroad opened this backward mountain region up to the outside world. However, Western North Carolina was not truly isolated prior to the coming of the railroad. By the end of the Civil War, and with the coming of this reliable mode of transportation, the rest of the world started viewing Western North Carolina as what it was, a world-renowned resource. The railroad provided a way to transport these raw materials in this area to a global economy. Yet even today, one thing most people are unaware of when one talks about the coming of the railroad to this area is that convict labor was responsible for the completion of what was known as the Western North Carolina Railroad between Salisbury and Murphy. So the precedents for African American convict labor had been laid before the Civil War even began. By 1862, railroad promoters had realized that a shortage of labor was delaying the completion of the W&C Railroad. William H. Thomas of the Cherokee Nation and Augustus S. Merriman from Asheville both wrote to Governor Vance, inquiring as to sending slaves from the eastern part of the state to labor on the railroad. Contracts were drawn up with slave owners, and wages varied based upon unskilled versus skilled labor. However, the number of slaves available to work on the railroad was based upon that year's agriculture. 1860 turned out to be a banner year, so that meant that there was a scarcity of slave labor available to work on the railroad at that time. However, by 1864, the South was deep into the Civil War, and military action had arrived on the W&C Railroad by June. General Stoneman, of Stoneman's Raid notoriety, systematically destroyed much of the railroad on his march into Tennessee. By 1868, a bond issue had been passed for new construction to extend the railroad from Morganton across the Blue Ridge and into Asheville. Native North Carolinian George W. Swepson and New Yorker Milton S. Littlefield secured control of the W&C Railroad. Unfortunately, the two of them were concerned only with their own profit, and they fraudulently ended up with 97% of the total stock share in the railroad. A commission was formed to investigate. It's called the Woodfin Commission, and it was chaired by Nicholas W. Woodfin of Asheville. And when the two men received word that they were about to be held accountable for their action, they ended up skipping town on a train in the middle of the night with no lights and $4 million worth of looted bonds. So after the scandal involving Swepson and the Prince of the Carpetbaggers, a new railroad commission was appointed, and the W&C Railroad was sold to Augustus Summerfield Merriman, who was acting as North Carolina's agent. The new commissioners appointed James W. Wilson, a former math teacher at the State University and a Confederate veteran, as chief engineer. Wilson was tasked with routing the railroad from Old Fort up and over through the Royal Gorge and into Black Mountain. During this time, the Civil War had ended, and the state had started using convicts for work in both the public and private sectors. It had become quite a practical practice and very lucrative. Convict labor system in the South was known as slavery by another name, and new laws made it easy to pick up any black person along the road and put them into prison. Such laws as pig laws, which made the theft of any farm animal worth $1 punishable by 5 years in jail, and vagrancy statutes, which made it a crime not to have a job or to be able to show proof of employment. Not surprisingly, just after the Civil War, 7/8 of the convicts in North Carolina at this time were African American. So the tiny hamlet of Old Fort was the western terminus of the W&C Railroad until 1876, and there was only one train a day each way. Passengers who were headed further west were met by Jack Pence and his stagecoach pulled by 6 white horses, and they were then conveyed over the crest of the Blue Ridge and into Asheville. By 1877, Wilson had been given a contract to start completing both the Swannanoa and Bergen tunnels, and the majority of this work ended up being done by convict labor. Wilson faced perplexing construction problems, though, including poor weather conditions and heavy growth of underbrush from non-use of the tracks during the Civil War. One previously laid tunnel had even caved in during a landslide, which wiped out all signs of human labor. It took almost a year to find a passable solution in that area, which would be called mud cut. The major hardship, though, was the actual construction of the track itself. The ascent was over 1,100 vertical feet from Old Fort to Ridgecrest in roughly 3 miles. In order to overcome this obstacle, a twisting, curving line of track was employed, which looped back on itself in order to obtain the required grade of about 2 feet per every 100 feet. This meant that around 786 vertical feet were able to be overcome in about 7.5 miles of track. The total curvature of the track was roughly 2,700 degrees, or about 8 complete circles, in order to negotiate the rise on the gradient of the mountain. It was also necessary to cut 6 tunnels: the Swannanoa at a little over 1,800 feet, Lick Log at 589 feet, High Ridge at 494 feet, Bergen at 260 feet, Jarrett's at 123 feet, and McElroy at 77 feet. Again, to put all of this in perspective, the track, the tunnel, the loops, the actual point-to-point distance up the escarpment is only about 3 miles. Easy to bike, easy to hike. By far the biggest obstacle to completion, though, was that Swannanoa tunnel. It proved particularly daunting because Wilson had to bore from both sides of the gap simultaneously. The small Norris-built 440 locomotive named the Salisbury helped with this task. However, getting it up there was an undertaking itself. It was hauled by 10 oxen and a crew of almost 300 convicts who were hitched and driven by whips like mules over the gap. A section of track was laid and the Salisbury was advanced. Previously laid sections were then pulled up and relayed at the front end of the locomotive. On the other side of the gap, the train was slid down the mountain on a skid. The Salisbury helped haul supplies and laborers to the work sites. The convicts were first shipped around October 1876 to Henry Station, which is 2 miles west of Old Fort. Some reports suggest around 300 men and 16 women convicts were employed at first. The cash value of their work was measured at around $51,000, or around 98 cents per day per worker. They built the Round Knob Stockade near Andrews Geyser. North Carolina had actually built a state penitentiary by 1870, and an average of 65% of its prison labor was taken by the construction of the Western North Carolina Railroad. Contracts stipulated convicts would labor at least an average of 10 hours each day. No person was held liable for the escape or mistreatment of any convict. Prisoners endured terrible working and living conditions, living in filthy railroad cars which had been converted into jailhouses on wheels. They even included iron rings to latch convicts' chains to the sides of the cars. By 1877, just 1 year later, some reports state that 430 convicts had worked an average of 7,700 days per month, and out of those, 42 had escaped, 30 had died, 4 were killed, roughly 99 were discharged or pardoned. They worked sun up to sundown. They were kept in various stockades between Henry Station and Swannanoa. Building the tunnels by hand had proved extremely dangerous for those working on these chain gangs. Since the end of the Civil War, black powder had become scarce in the South, obviously. So to solve the issue of excavating solid granite, huge pyres of pine logs were cut down by hand, stacked, and burnt to hot coals by the convicts. They would then pour cold water onto these rocks, and this sudden contraction would split the rock in half for the tunnel construction. Nitroglycerin was also used at this time. It was mixed in part with sawdust and cornmeal and then tamped down into a drill hole. These convicts were not trained to handle these types of explosives, and many died, buried in countless unmarked graves right alongside the track. By late 1877, almost all convicts were being transported in from the eastern part of the state, and the climate and unvaried diet in Western North Carolina made disease a daily part of camp life. The state penitentiary was responsible for guarding, feeding, clothing, and doctoring these convicts. Any superior court judge could order them to work on the W&C Railroad, and once the line was met at Asheville, they were then sent to finish lines at Paint Rock or Murphy. By spring of 1879, Wilson was getting close to completion of the project and finishing the largest tunnel, the Swannanoa. Multiple cave-ins and deaths were normal occurrences. When the two crews on opposite ends of the tunnel met on May 11, 1879, Wilson wired Governor Vance the following message: "Daylight entered Buncombe County today through the Swannanoa Tunnel." The news was hailed with delight and excitement by locals, railroad representatives, and prominent citizens. However, just after Wilson's victory telegram, another cave-in occurred, crushing 20 more convicts to death. In all total, over 3,000 convict laborers worked on this project, and reports suggest between 125 and 300 convicts died during its construction. The actual cost of human life may never be truly quantifiable, though, but the memory of those who gave up their blood, sweat, and very lives on the completion of this monumental undertaking should always be remembered. And one more thing before I turn this over to Dan. You might wonder how Colonel Alexander Boyd Andrews' name ended up on the name on the geyser. If you've been down there and seen it before, it's Andrews Geyser, which lies right alongside the tracks on Mills Creek. Andrews was a railroad executive and a construction engineer, and he assumed control of the Western North Carolina Railroad as president in 1880. He completed the line west of Asheville, and by 1891 it had reached the original goal of Ducktown, Tennessee. He also owned a half interest in the Round Knob Hotel. Now, when I was little, we used to go up there. I'd read the monument, know that the geyser was called Andrews Geyser. I always thought he was responsible for the completion of the railroad up the mountain. I find it interesting that that's true when he was really only one small part of a much larger, much more complicated history. So finally, if you're interested in more information, next Wednesday, I'm unveiling our new website that I've been working on, therailproject.org. This is going to be a place to go for more information, so you need to check it out next Wednesday. And before I get any further long-winded, I'm going to turn this over to who you really came here to talk, Dr. Dan Pierce.
All right, thank you, Ashley. I hope for everyone to have that kind of experience. I have been proud of this young woman for a long time for a lot of reasons, but she did an excellent job of explaining and giving a good synopsis of the history. So I want to talk about our project and how it came to be and where it's going. Okay, so this is where I live. It's really interesting, the folks involved here. There are so many of us that have a personal connection to this. I live right at the Swannanoa Gap, if you're familiar where that is, right at Ridgecrest. And about a half a mile from this view, looking down over Royal Gorge and over the top of the Swannanoa Tunnel. And I spend a lot of time there, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But like many of you, I started kind of, I guess, doing some soul searching back during the spring as the Black Lives Matter movement came up, and began thinking about what I could do. And one of the things I think is important when we look at things like this is to look at our own neighborhood and see what we could do. So I spend a lot of time here. I do a lot of hiking in the area. I bike down the Point Lookout Greenway quite frequently and up Mill Creek Road by Andrews Geyser. So I spend a lot of time in this area, and as a historian, I think about a couple of things. One, I think about the significance of this railroad, about what it meant to Western North Carolina. Now, there aren't many trains running on these tracks today, mainly taking wood chips to Canton for the pulp mill there. But for 100 and how many years, 150 years almost. This was a chief link into Western North Carolina and really made Western North Carolina what it is in many ways, highly significant and an amazing engineering project. We talked about that, and there's the map there of the railroad that you've already seen. But again, just if you go next to the track, it's just amazing what was accomplished in that period. But I also think often about the people who actually did this, and think about their sacrifice. I particularly think, about the fact that I live in a neighborhood that has at least we know from penitentiary records, that at least 139 of the workers who built this railroad died in the process. And so I live in a place of amazing beauty, in a place that has an amazing engineering marvel, and a place that has hundreds of unmarked graves. And that's a sobering thought. And so as I think about that, or thought about that for years, I thought, and particularly coming by Andrews Geyser, because there are several things commemorated at Andrews Geyser other than Andrews. And one of those is the fact there's a Confederate memorial on the site there. And commemoration of the Battle of Swannanoa Gap back in the latter days of the Civil War that took place there. There's a memorial to James Wilson down in Old Fort next to the train station. But there's no public recognition whatsoever of the sacrifice of these individuals that Ashley so eloquently explained to us. There's no recognition of that sacrifice really anywhere. There's a brief mention on a historical, state historical marker at the top, right at Swannanoa Gap, commemorating the Swannanoa Tunnel, that just mentions that it was convict labor that did this. And so I've long felt this, and then I think in response to Black Lives Matter and some other things, I thought, okay, enough of thinking about this. Let's try and do something. So I contacted an old friend of mine by the name of Steve Little. Steve is a lawyer. He's an attorney in Marion, and he's also the mayor of Marion. He grew up coming to camp at Ridgecrest back in the 60s, and has had a long connection with Ridgecrest Camp for Boys that I do, and that's how we got to know each other. But he has had, I would characterize it really, and I think you would agree, an obsession with this railroad line since he was a child. And so I called Steve. We socially distanced and sat on my porch, and on July 7th. And we decided to try and move forward on constructing a memorial to the people, to these incarcerated laborers who built this amazing engineering feat. And so we asked some people, and this was a really amazing thing. We asked a group of people to come together and form a committee. And, you know, I've worked with committees for a long time. I've never been in a case where everybody you ask immediately agreed to serve. And so we try to balance between McDowell County folks or people with McDowell County connections and Buncombe County, and just bring together the right people, and I think we did. Just to mention real quickly, one of the really interesting things that we have two chiefs of police on our committee. We have Chief Melvin Lytle, who's the chief of police in Old Fort, and Chief Eric Boyce, who is our own UNC Asheville chief of police, and a legend, I might add. We also have Ray McKesson, who is retired from McDowell Tech, the CFO there, but is also the head of the McDowell County NAACP. Rowan Bishop, who is the director of the Mountain Gateway Museum in Old Fort. Ashley is on our committee. Jim Stokely, whose mother, Wilma Dykeman, wrote one of the first accounts of the fact that this railroad was built by prisoners and the horrible conditions under which they labored. So Jim is the head of the Wilma Dykeman legacy. We asked Darren Waters, who is a special assistant to the chancellor, and they have the honors program at UNC Asheville, and Chesky Smith, who is the head of the Western North Carolina Historical Association, and Jeff Futch, who I believe is on our Zoom today, who is the head of the Western Regional Office of Archives of the State Division of Archives and History. And so, again, just a wonderful group to work with. And this has been an amazing process about how this worked. The first thing we did was to put together a proposal that Steve Little wrote, and then we wordsmithed it with the committee to go to the Board of Aldermen at Old Fort. And we asked permission to put a memorial at Andrews Geyser. And I would encourage you to go down to Andrews Geyser. It's a beautiful place. And so, but it's the town of Old Fort owns the geyser, and so we asked permission to put a memorial up there to the people who built the railroad. To these, and we came up with I think it's a good name because I came up with it, but it's called RAIL, which stands for Railroad Incarcerated Laborer Memorial, and so that's what it is. This is an appropriate site, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. But this is located at an area called Round Knob, which was the site of a hotel. But before that, it was the site of the largest stockade, where the prisoners were housed during as they worked on the railroad going up the mountain, and a site that we don't know specifically where, but there are untold numbers of graves, of unmarked graves in this area. We know that, but we just don't know where. So we went to the Board of Aldermen. Chief Lytle. Old Fort's kind of like Mayberry. So Chief Lytle is the chief of police, but he also serves on the Board of Aldermen. And he was crucial in this process as he, and contacted Steve and I early on in the process and said, can you be ready with a proposal for the August 10th Board of Aldermen meeting? And we kind of thought, what? This quickly, things are going to move this quickly. And he said, I've already talked to all the Board of Aldermen and they're all in agreement. So we went to the Board of Aldermen on August 10th, and they gave us their unanimous approval. And I'll never forget the mayor of Old Fort is a very conservative individual. I don't think he would object to that. But he made the statement. Someone in the meeting said, we need to do this and I don't remember what the reason was that they mentioned, but the mayor then chimed in and said, we need to do this because it's the right thing to do. And so the Board of Aldermen not only approved our proposal, but agreed to give us $1,000 for the project to help kickstart this project along the way. Because part of the agreement is that the rail committee it has a task of raising the money and hiring the folks to construct the memorial. And I'll give you an idea of what the memorial is going to look like. This is was put up by the city of Old Fort to explain the site and talk about Andrews and a little bit about the history of the site. Our memorial is going to be kind of a twin to this. It will be similar size. The plaque is going to look very different. But this is basically what it's going to look like, and it will be kind of framing making a gateway really into Andrews Geyser. So that's what the memorial will look like eventually. A couple of features that, and the committee, actually we're meeting next week to talk about language on the plaque and also other features. One of the, Rowan Bishop made the suggestion early on that I really liked, that there ought to be, one of the things we want, there ought to be an image or some sort of image on the plaque. And we all agreed that would be a great idea. Of course, that will be dependent on how much money we can raise. But Jeff Keith, who is a professor at Warren Wilson College, who I've gotten to know in this process, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later, suggested that we not have an image of these men in their striped uniforms, but that we focus on the faces and have images of the faces of a number of these men who labored. And again, I can't emphasize, Ashley said it so well about the nature of their incarceration, the fact that they're incarcerated, based on these pig laws and larceny laws and, larceny, really trumped up larceny laws and vagrancy laws, and sentenced to hard labor for years at a time for trumped up charges. And in many cases, they were just pulled off the side of the road and for doing nothing other than being black. And so we want to focus on the faces. And so this is an image actually from Round Knob. And we're going to try to pull facial images off of this, which will be embossed in the plaque itself. So I love that idea to really humanize these people. Chief Boyce made a point and early on that, we don't want to characterize these people as convicts so much, but as human beings. And, that's really important. So we really want to humanize this as well. Another way we want to humanize this, and this is something I propose and is subject to committee approval, and I hope that we will have at least a few verses of the song Swannanoa Tunnel. Now, I put up here, and note this website, and if you send an email to Ashley, she'll send you a link, right, Ashley? But this is to a recent article in the Bitter Southerner, an online journal, by Jeff Keith and Kevin Kerberg. And Jeff's a historian, Kevin is a musicologist, and they have been researching the song Swannanoa Tunnel. I won't go into the detail about this in the interest of time, but it's it's an incredible article. It's even got drone footage of going through the Swannanoa Tunnel. I'm not sure how they did this, but this is an old song. It's generally attributed to Bascom Lamar Lunsford. Those of you who know Western North Carolina history are familiar with him. But the version that they like the most actually comes from this man on the right named Will Love. Will Love lived in Durham, and he delivered mail on the Duke University campus for many, many years, I think 40 plus years. But he also was, he sang, he played the guitar, and he was recorded by a Duke University professor doing some old traditional tunes, mainly gospel tunes. Well, Jeff and Kevin have discovered that he recorded a version for that professor of Swannanoa Tunnel that they hadn't heard before. And it's much closer to the roots. I don't have the capability of playing it for you, but there's a link in the article to the tune and of Will Love doing this tune. And I just want to read you a few of the verses that Will Love recorded. Of course, like traditional music, there are all kinds of versions of this, and there are literally hundreds of versions of Swannanoa Tunnel. But here are a few of the verses, and that I hope will be included as a legacy, because Jeff and Kevin believe that Will Love learned this tune from, was passed down possibly from someone who worked on the tunnel. And this is what's called the version that you generally hear is kind of a more of a bluegrass traditional music version. But this version is in the spirit of what's called a hammer song, which is a work song. And we believe that it was composed by the workers who built the Swannanoa Tunnel and who built the railroad up the mountain. So it stands really as a living tribute to those individuals. So I'll just read you a few words. Asheville Junction, Swannanoa Tunnel, all caved in, babe, all caved in. When you hear that hoot owl squalling, somebody's died. somebody's dead. Hammer falling from my shoulders all day long, all day long. I'm going back to Swannanoa Tunnel. That's my home, babe. That's my home. And of course, for too many people, the Swannanoa Tunnel is their permanent home, and we want to remember that. So that's a little bit about our project and what's going on, just to kind of update you. We're in the process now of publicizing. There'll be an article next week in the Mountain Express. In October, WNC Magazine will have an article. The website's going live next week that I actually showed you. And that will give you an opportunity to support this project if you would like. We would, hope, again, for your moral support and encouragement, but we would also welcome any financial help you would give us. So real quickly, we want to allow some time for questions, but I want to let Eric Boyce, Chief Boyce, talk a little bit about his interest and involvement in this project.
Something may be wrong with his microphone on his end.
Eric, you want to go out and come back in maybe and see if that works, and we'll see if we can get Eric on, and I'll tap dance a little bit, and we can take. Can we start with questions then, and we'll hear from Eric when he comes back on. Ashley, can we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have any questions? Just want to unmute yourself and ask away.
I'm Jan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just went on, I like to research. So I just looked up Will Love. Boy, online, there's a lot online about this too. So we could go online and really research even further about Will Love and, the tunnel and everything. So I really love this. So we can really get more in depth about it. The songs and Warren Wilson professor's research, the Swannanoa Tunnel. I mean, there's so much, and I really appreciate what you've given us, but the song, and it's exciting for those of us who are at home and want to even go deeper, and thank you.
All right, thank you. Chief Boyce, let's try again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan and Ashley, and it was really amazing to be reached out to by Dan and asked to be a part of this project. I grew up in Marion, Pleasant Gardens area, so very familiar with Andrews Geyser and this whole area, and so it kind of hit home. And one of the interesting things that I wanted to learn from this project is I originally thought that it would be local, but the fact that, the laborers were brought in, and I just really felt like, because it was such an important connection made to Western North Carolina, and it had such a commercial impact, that although these folks worked under less than favorable condition, that when we honor their memory, that we humanize them as people, recognizing that their circumstances were not all, that we would think about when we think about a convict laborer. The fact that some of these people were just picked up just for the color of their skin, and so that just really just kind of struck a chord with me, that we not only commemorate them and recognize them, but that we do so in a human way, and not focus so much on the fact that they were convicts, but the fact that they did some pretty amazing labor that a lot of skilled people during the time probably couldn't have done. So that's just a little bit about why I'm enjoying being a part of this project, and I'm learning from Dan Pierce, probably one of the most legendary people on campus. So I'm enjoying myself.
Well, I
Dan?
think my legend, Eric, may be for the bad things I've done. Yours is for the good. So, other than those parking tickets, but
Yeah.
yeah. Well, let's go to the chat and look at some of these. Jessica Bond mentions that a lot of convict laborers were treated the same way and were killed, mistreated in mass building our highways in the 1930s. And this is very much a part of why I think this is an important project, is that we look at American history and we realize how much of what we are as a nation, the debt that we owe to people who really labored under abysmal conditions. There's a great history textbook called Who Built America? And I think we need to have that recognition that of the sacrifice of people, not by their choice, to do that work. And so, and so I think that makes it really important. Sarah Van Gunten says, I ask, you mentioned that women were also forced to work on the railroad. Do you have any more specific information that could be incorporated into the memorial? Yeah, this is something, one of the things in terms of the memorial that we're going, and there's Roanne Bishop, another, I see Roanne, another committee member. So it's great to have committee members on this. One of the things actually Roanne's been helping with is doing a wayside exhibit kind of thing next to the memorial that would go more in depth into the history behind this. And that's definitely something. It's a complicated issue with women. We don't have as much information about the women, but there were, I think, Ashley, do you remember? I think I want to say 50 women or so that were.
Yeah, the number has varied. I've seen anything from about 25 all the way up to about 60.
Yeah. So at one time or another that were there, I think primarily working as laundresses and cooks and things like that on the project. And so that is something that we do want to honor, not just the men, but also the women who were involved in this. And again, incarcerated for the same bad reasons in many ways. Amanda Maxwell says, do you think there's a way to identify any of the burial sites for the people who died during the construction? This is something, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. I think, Ashley may know some, I know some, I won't say where. We talked about this with the committee, but there is anecdotal evidence of a mass burial site, possibly related to the cave-in of the Swannanoa Tunnel, that people who lived in the area for a long time have pointed out as a possible site. It's one thing we want to research. There are other rumors about places along the tracks. Ashley, do you know, you've heard stories, I think, haven't you?
Yes, I've heard many stories.
Yeah, so this is one thing we want to, and actually we're thinking about the work of the committee beyond the memorial, that we would try to locate some of these sites. We may never be able to do this, but we hope that we will, and we'll be able to mark some of these sites and directly, as a way. Again, it's interesting. Jeff Keith and I were talking the other day, and he's descended from a long line of memorial makers of headstones and things like that. And he, talks about the importance of commemorating these places of burial. So it's something we're going to try to do. We even have a possibility of getting some ground penetrating radar equipment to do some searching. We're going to have to, get permission from landowners and things like that. And people don't necessarily want you doing that kind of research on their land. But it is something that we are we are trying to find out more information about. So if you know of anything, please let us know if you've heard stories along the way. Marilyn Bonham asked if we've had positive support. Has there been any negative response? I really, honestly anticipated that we would get some pushback on this, but so far, knock on wood, we have only had positive responses, and we hope that lasts. And so the community support in Old Fort and McDowell County, has been just incredible. The people, we really haven't solicited funds from anyone, but people have already come out of the woodwork to give us money. And so, and again, I'll make a pitch there, go to the website when it comes up, and there's a link to our fiscal agent is the Western North Carolina Historical Association. So donations go through them.
Dan, we've had another question sent to me on chat just now. It's from Rod Baird. It says, I recall a large number of convicts on a chain gang drowning on the Tuckasegee near Dillsboro. Was convict labor used across Western North Carolina?
Yes, the whole railroad system in Western North Carolina, the basics of it was built with these incarcerated laborers. And so the railroad up from up the Saluda grade, across Western North Carolina to the north up through Paint Rock, that area were all built using overwhelmingly African American. Most of these people were, we do know, most were former slaves as well, and that was probably one of the more publicized tragedies, in that there was a ferry over the Tuckasegee River that they were taking laborers across, chained together, and the ferry sank, and almost everyone drowned, except a few. And so that's something that, again, I think the work of the committee, we may look into. To my knowledge, there's no commemoration at that site, and I think that would be appropriate. And that site is well known out near Dillsboro. These questions have been great. I tell you, they're just dead on. Scott Walker asked the question, is there knowledge of the names of at least some of the workers, or a way to start researching and collecting their names? And this is something that we also want to include in the memorial. We do know some names. Some of those names we find in Ann Chesky Smith, when she was the head of the Swannanoa Valley Museum, did some research and found some names in newspapers accounts of escapes where people were shot trying to escape. So we know a few of those names. I just found out, and this is, the politics, I won't get into the politics of the census, but, there are times when you don't want to count everybody, and there are times when you do want to count everybody, depending on your perspective and your political viewpoint. And so we have in the 1880 census 130 names of, I think they're all men, who were working on the railroad in Old Fort area. And so that is something we're going to find a way to include. We'll definitely memorialize those names on our website, and hopefully be able to memorialize them at the memorial itself. Perhaps we'll have text on the front and hopefully names on the back. So, a lot of that has to do with the next question from Mark Baird. How much money do you hope to raise? And a lot will depend on the money we raise. We haven't set a specific goal. I kind of have a personal goal of around $10,000 that we would like to have to do everything that we would want to do, and have quality of memorial that we would like, and the wayside exhibit, and be able to list the names of the workers we know. Because I think just as having those pictures on the memorial, having those names stated, and I think probably at one of the things we'll do at the dedication, which we hope to have by the spring, would be a reading of those names. And that's an important thing, to acknowledge these people. As Chief Boyce said, we want to humanize this as much. I think the whole notion of, well, if you saw that one image that Ashley put up, there was a postcard that was famous saying, it says stripes, but no stars. And so, it was a dehumanizing thing, and people laughed about it and made jokes and thought this was a funny postcard at one point. And we want to talk about the seriousness of this and to humanize these individuals and help people to see the humanity here. Mark has another question. Were all of the workers African American? Over 90%. There were a few white convicts that worked on this, and there were plenty of white contract laborers as well. But again, 90%, almost all of them former slaves as well. So Amanda Maxwell asked, where can we find a link to the recording of this presentation to share with others? And Ashley or Jean, I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, I just sent that to Jean. I believe that will be available on the Ramsey Library website. Is that right, Jean?
It'll be available on the Ramsey Library website, but we can also put it on your website for the Rail Project as well. And what we do with these is our good folks down in our video production thing will get them closed captioned, so it may be several weeks before this gets up. But I can have Dan and Ash make sure you all know when it's available.
Okay, so please share that with other folks. And thank you, John Morris, and thank you, folks, for coming out. And again, please share word. And again, we're going to get more publicity, but please share word. If you have any questions about the project, please feel free to email me or Ashley with this, about this. My email is dpierce. Ashley, you can put both our emails in there in the chat. And if you have questions about the project, please feel free to ask, and we'll be glad to share with you. So I'll turn it back over to Jean.
Well, thank you all, and thanks to committee so much for all this great work. And if we were live in a room, we would applaud now. So